Planning and Community Development Committee of 2019, and thank you for being here. We have a very busy agenda this morning. I'd like to also welcome Brenda Rowe, who's the alternate for Director Lamb, and I believe this is the first time, Brenda, that you'll be sitting in as alternate, and welcome. And I'd let you know as well that Director Julius was not able to attend this morning as well, so that he's absent. So acknowledge we are meeting this morning on the territory of the Sechelt First Nation, and that we are ready to proceed. If everybody else is ready, we have nobody got their hand up, so we'll go. First of all, I'd like to have a motion to adopt the agenda. Director Pratt, Director Seegers, all in favor? It's approved. And we have a number of presentations this morning, so we're going to start right off with that. And the first presentation, the report, and you've all read the first 200 pages, I'm sure. It's the report. That's with the Fire Chief, the Special Projects, and Chief Administrative Officer, SCRD Fire Department Strategic Plan. And for the introduction by Dave Mitchell and Associates. And who will lead that off? To the CAO, Janet.
Thank you, Director Beamish. So we're happy to present this report, and before we ask our consultants to kick off with an introduction, I would like to take the opportunity, if I may, to introduce a number of fire chiefs that we have in our audience today. So first I would like to introduce beside me Bill Higgs, and so many of you will remember Bill Higgs from his time at Sechelt, but I also want to acknowledge that we've been lucky here at the Regional District to bring him on board, and he is our Special Projects Fire Chief. And recently he has been also received his designation of Executive Chief Officer, which is only about 120 people in Canada have this designation, so quite a special honor. And I'm going to start at the top of the coast, and so Chief Hellier from Egmont District, Volunteer Fire Department. And next is, I'm going to go actually just down here, Pat Higgins for the Roberts Creek Volunteer Fire Department, and Chief Daly, who is a Half Moon Bay Volunteer Fire Department, and at the south part is Chief Michael Gibson District Volunteer Fire Department. And with that, I'm going to then introduce our consultants that have been working with us over for many past months here. So it's Dave Mitchell and Ian McDonald and Wayne Humphrey. And I'll let them do their presentation.
Well, thank you, and welcome, Fire Chiefs. It's good to see you, and yeah, I'm going to have an interesting morning, I'm sure. So that and welcome, gentlemen, to your presentation. And I understand you have a PowerPoint, and short introduction to it before we want to move some chairs around, or what do you want to do?
Yeah. Sure. Is it going to get put up on the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's ready to go to Mr. Chairman.
Okay. A couple of us are just going to move so we can actually watch it. Thank you.
Okay. Are we good to go? Okay, well, good morning, and on behalf of my colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning and speak to the report. This isn't an overly long PowerPoint. You've got the report in front of you. We wanted to just really touch on some of the highlights and then make sure we had plenty of time to answer your questions. To say that Dave Mitchell and Associates is a group of people, we've been established as a consulting company since 2000, but we have a long history of public safety in the province of BC, in my case starting in 1966 in April when I joined the Vancouver Fire Department. Wayne is just a little bit behind me. He's also formerly with Vancouver Fire, where he was a battalion chief plus the chief training officer. Coincidentally, we also went to the same high school, but a few years apart. And Ian McDonald in the middle is a retired corporate lawyer who practiced in Canada and in the United Kingdom before he came back here. He lives in Sechelt, and Wayne is a joyful taxpayer in Gibsons. So we wanted to let you know as well that we've done a lot of work in this area, and in fact in most sorts of services in BC. In working for the province of British Columbia, I worked with Gary Philman on the review of the 2003 firestorms. I have worked a lot of projects with the province since then. We're actually underway with 2 different ones at the moment. We've worked probably with just about every regional district in the province on similar projects: Squamish, Lillooet, the Peace River, Fraser Fort George, Central Kootenay, and so on. So we worked a lot with regional districts, and I think we have some good sense of the issues before you, and I think we want to try and explain in the report that there are a lot of things that are changing both in the governance and the operation of local government, but also in the fire services. And working with local governments, we've worked with the the smaller size fire departments, Seashelt, we've worked with Pender Harbour and Whistler, with Kamloops and Saanich and that size, right up to Vancouver, Winnipeg, Calgary, and the Toronto Fire Departments. So we've worked a lot in the fire services and with local government in BC. So a lot of things on this slide. I'm not going to speak to every one of them for sure. You've had a chance to go through the report, I think, and you'll probably have a lot of questions. The message in some ways for your regional district is the issues that you are addressing that are flagged in the report are ones that everyone has to deal with. It's not particular only to the Sunshine Coast, and in fact the regulatory environment is one that is particularly interesting, but it really applies to everyone. And the items in the regulatory issues, the playbook, WorkSafe, the Coming Fire Safety Act, and so on, these are all mandatory things to do. These are things that we're required to meet, and they're certainly different from the time that Wayne and I were young members of the department in Vancouver. The regulatory oversight, the regulatory process is really changed. It has become more complex, and so that's one of the issues facing your fire chiefs, your departments, and you as a regional district. The regulatory changes, though, are not, we would recommend you don't see them as onerous and problematic. Rather, they're there to provide as safe and effective a fire service as we can for you when you or your constituents are having the worst day of their life. We want the folks that arrive there to be appropriately trained, equipped, and experienced, and managed so that they can provide the best outcome. And so, as required, Wayne can talk about that. You also know from reading the report, and I've had the chance to speak with a couple of you already this morning, that the services provided have increased in the number and complexity. So the kinds of rescue that fire services are called on to do today, that's not something we did 50 years ago. So for your fire department, it's not just a one-size-fits-all thing. It has to respond to a whole range of services and requests, which there's more of them, there's more kinds of them, and they're increasingly complex. So that's kind of a message. And when we talk about the recommendations in the report, that's part of the point, the reason we focused on that. The emerging issues are both technical and operational, and so we'll go through these ones in the report. In our review, this was the model, and we've used this for more than 100 fire departments in BC. Regional district fire departments within the last year. We've worked with the Peace River Regional District Fire Departments, the Regional District of Okanagan, Similkameen's Fire Departments, and Thompson-Nicola Regional District in the last year, previous years with many others. So we've done a lot of these kinds of things. But this particular review was configured for your particular requirements. So we met with the department, we met with the administrator, and made sure that we focused on seeing all of the things that we needed to see so we could come back here with a report was circulated and something we could speak to that would help you with the decisions going forward. And I have to note to you that your chiefs and the members that we met with were, without exception, very professional and very fully engaged. It was a delight to work with them. I may have mentioned earlier, I've been working with your department since 1997 when we did the dispatch transition to Vancouver Fire, where I was working at the time. But the response from the cooperation from the chief officers and their members was just absolutely exemplary. So the fire service context, issues for you as a local government. is that your fire service is really the only one that you control locally. Police and ambulance services are governed and funded differently, but you are responsible for your fire service, the level of service they provide. And you do this through establishment bylaws and operational bylaws, and you will see a good conversation in the document, Ian's piece on this about the requirement to make sure that your description of your service allows you to do the things that you want it to do, and that when you operate wherever they operate in the regional district, that they have the power to operate, to protect them, and to make sure that they can do what they need to do. And as always with local funding, to meet the service level that you approve. So we'll put the slide up here. You know, I think that fires and other emergencies that your service respond to are time critical, but you may not have seen this piece. It's called the fire propagation curve, and it helps us understand why we have, frankly, lights and sirens on the fire truck, air horns, we have traffic signal preemption, we have paging systems that should allow us to respond as quickly as possible, because from the time a fire ignites to about 8 or 10 minutes into it, and no two are exactly the same. There is very well documented evidence that a fire will extend beyond the room of origin. And so a whole bunch of things have to happen in that period of time. The response by your fire department is not just the drive time. It's the sum of the time for a 911 transfer, for the dispatcher to answer the call, to dispatch the crews, for them to be paged, for them to get to the fire hall and travel to the scene. So we don't have a lot of time to get this done. Wayne could talk more about this, and your chief officers will know this as well. The 8 to 10 minutes for the extension from the room of origin is really based on research on older construction. Newer construction, in fact, it probably occurs more quickly than that. Many of the products we see in construction are more flammable. There is more synthetic material. So, in fact, this hasn't got easier for any of us. It's actually become more difficult. And so there's a lot of pieces that go into that. So when we say, well, what does this mean? What does it actually mean? What's the business case? Why is the reason we care? Here's some graphical information, and this is based on residential fires and a lot of data on it. And so you can see, well, the dollar loss and the deaths per 1,000 fires. If the fire is held to the room of origin, in terms of fire deaths, less than 2 deaths per 1,000 fires. But if it extends beyond the room of origin, just to the floor of origin, there's more than 10 times as many people are going to die. So I know everybody in the room always gets it. It is a time-critical issue, but we now have very good data to say how critical it is. And so we know that everything we can do to enhance your chief officers, their firefighters, their departments to respond as optimally as we can, there's a very good reason, and we can now demonstrate that with a very good set of statistics. In terms of call volume, probably no surprise to you, but everybody here is getting busier than they were. When we did the dispatch transition back in 1997 to Vancouver Fire, and Wayne, you were there at the time too, the call volume was a lot smaller than it is now. And so the call volume is rising, as you can see. And we've got good data from your fire department dispatch provider, ECOM. We've got very good data, which I provide to the chiefs on an annual basis as they require it. But we can see that the call volume is rising. You can see the trend line. And if we take this out further and run a 10-year projection, we're looking at 1,072 calls for the 4 fire departments, where in 2009 they had 325. So they're a more than 3-fold increase in about 20 years. And not only are there more calls, there are more complex calls, buildings are getting bigger, and we have all of those issues to deal with. Response by month. So this, I think, hopefully you found this interesting when you saw the larger set of stats on the report. But the department is not kind of universal, one thing all the time. It's not vanilla. It really ranges in a significant way throughout the year by month. So you can see that August is more than double the call volume of March. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution that you have here. Your chief officers and the administration have to manage a very complex thing, which is also very dynamic. Response by the hour, I think this one is always very interesting to see. The range of responses by hour is very, very significant. And it's busiest as well during what we might call business hours, at a time when many volunteers may not be in the area. They may be away at work. They may be doing something else. And so, as you know, a degree of automatic mutual aid has now been put in place between multiple departments, because some areas at the time when the call volume is at the peak, there's not a lot of people there. So it's led to some innovative solutions. And in fact, your fire chiefs and your departments here have done some very creative work in this area that has actually been modeled in the rest of the province. So we see more responses to this variable pattern, both busier months, quieter months, but busier hours, quieter hours. And this has to be reflected in all the things your department does. By type of call, my goodness, there's just a huge range of things that your fire service goes to. Once upon a time, maybe it would have been before my time as well, it isn't just a fire department anymore. It's a multifaceted emergency and non-emergency response provider. So you can see the range there of all of the call types across the region. They're caused by, there's three things that cause fire department responses. You probably know: men, women, and children. And so as we add more of them, we get more responses. The types of responses have increased. Once upon a time, we didn't do technical rescue in the fire service. We do today, plus the number of them also are increasing. So just a very quick look. Gibson's a busy department, as you know, so their calls have just about doubled between 2011 and 2017, and someone has to do all of that. And so part of the conversation here is, how do we support the chiefs and the departments with all of the administrative stuff that needs to go into operating these as well. Roberts Creek as well, nearly tripled since 2011, and that's not an insignificant increase when we think about all of the things that go into the background of what the department has to do and what the chief officer and the administration have to do. Half Moon Bay, they're obviously doing some pretty creative things there as well, and very much busier. They've opened a second fire hall, as you know, some years ago, but they are getting busier. And finally, as we look at Egmont, it's not a big call volume, but it is also increasing and has more than doubled over the past 4 years. So every place we look at on the coast, we see your service going to more complex calls and more of all kinds of calls. In sum, every one of them is getting busier. So key issues. We're just going to talk here and maybe one more slide, and then look for your chat about it. Each of these issues is discussed in detail in the report, so certainly not going to verbatim read the report now. We provided recommendations to ensure compliance and effective response, which in your case says the authority having jurisdiction you need to see. Key to this will be a level of regional support by the creation of a manager of protective services. And this position will optimize the fire services and emergency planning. And so the second report to come on the emergency planning. This is not a regional fire chief. What we're looking to do here is instead provide someone, a manager of protective services, that will instead be focused on the operational and fiscal efficiency by supporting the chiefs and the departments with what they need to do, to provide administrative support for the fire chiefs to allow them to focus on managing their departments. So many things need to be done. The training is a huge thing to coordinate and manage. It needs to be recorded. And things like standard operating guidelines, and we provided a sample set to the departments, which I think they would like to adopt, but there's a lot of work needs to be done there. So all of those are the key issues in front of you and in front of your chief officers, and it is our proposal that this be supported in a way to help guide this and optimize it. Summary and conclusions. This is just what I have said earlier. Fire responses is increasingly complex by type and by volume. The fire trucks are more complex than they used to be. They have an awful lot more services that they provide. They are more complex mechanically, electronically. Regulatory oversight is complex, and underline it's mandatory. You can't opt out of the playbook. You can't opt out of WorkSafe. We can't opt out of any of these things. And so we need to be sure that we have everything understood, we have it supported, we have it recorded, so that if some bad, awful thing happens, and we hope it never does, but it does happen from time to time that we know that you've done what you need to do, and as a board, as the authority having jurisdiction, you can assure yourselves that the service is being provided to the level that you have approved. Review process, the chief officers and the responders are highly engaged. Just a pleasure. I've known them many of them for more than 20 years, but in this whole report, we had their total support. They were fully engaged. There wasn't anything that was a concern. So the manager of protective services for fire and emergency plan optimization, there's a lot of work to be done there, and so they would provide at the very highest level support for training for record management, which is one of those things you say to yourself, well, all the paperwork, right? Well, now oftentimes is done electronically, but it has to be done. It has to be done to ensure that you are compliant. You have to be able to demonstrate your compliance, to work safe, and to, heaven forbid, a lawyer if anything goes wrong. Also, the bylaws and mutual aid agreements, they need some work, but everybody's bylaws need refreshing from time to time, because always remember that your fire department, your fire service, only has the permission to do what is stated in the bylaw. Fire service is a voluntary service in any case in BC. It's not mandatory, and it only has the powers that you give it. So I think Ian has pointed out a number of areas where the bylaws which govern and allow you to do what you're doing need to be looked at. And mutual aid agreements, they're a wonderful thing, and I will say again, the work that you did between multiple departments here is seen as a high water mark, as a best practice in BC, and you're certainly to be commended for that. They will continue to be expanded. And so really, thank you for that attention, and if there's any questions, any one of the three of us are more than happy to speak to those.
Well, thank you very much. It is a very comprehensive report. I appreciate having gone through it this weekend and yesterday. I guess, first of all, we have to make a motion to receive the report. And somebody like to move that? Director Pratt, Director Ties, all in favor? Thank you. It's approved. And questions right now to the board. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Are you able to comprehend it all and ask questions at this time? Director McMahon?
I'm just curious if we ever run up all the statistics for the whole coast, because I realize that Pender Harbour and Sechelt are separate improvement districts, but they are part of the coast, and the fire departments do coordinate together. So do we ever look at the thing as a whole region?
Yes, we do. And in fact, in some work that I do contracted with ECOM, I actually provide each of the 6 fire chiefs with an annual report when they want it. So they're welcome to share them. I don't give them everybody's because it's their own report, but they in fact are always welcome to get that. And we'll be chatting with them about refreshing it for the 2018 year. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. Other questions? Director Hiltz?
Yes, thank you, Chair Beamish. Thanks for the report. It is very technical. So I'm going to sorry. This one. Better? Yeah. Thank you, Chair Beamish. Yeah, technical report. So I'm going to ask you kind of this is on page 67. Or sorry, 73. And it's kind of in terms of the recommendation about the career fires chief. So it says, in addition, the SCRD should be proactive in explaining to the residents the reasons behind any operational budget increase. So I guess I'm asking for advice on when someone comes up to me and says, why do we need a career fire chief? So like a couple sentences that I can...
The elevator message really is this, and go back and look at the statistics. your departments are doing more of everything. They're doing more complex calls, and they now have to be compliant with a new regulatory process called the playbook. And Wayne can talk about the playbook, and we are very supportive of the playbook because it's given guidance to authority having jurisdiction to say for a certain level of service, these are all of the things that you need to do, and they appear at the end of the report. It ends up to be about 30 pages of stuff, and so all you really say is, for us to provide service to respond to your fire or other emergency, our people need to be trained, they need to be supervised, and they need to be equipped. And that's the reason we're going to do these things. It's enlightened self-interest, Director, to be honest. I probably not.
So the difference between volunteer and career, I don't really understand.
It just means that there's more things for them to do. So you have 2 at the moment that we recommend become career because there simply is more of everything to do. And if you aren't a career member, then you have to find some other way to make a living as well, and it distracts from everything else you need to do. The 2 folks that are here that are currently not full-time chiefs, they do an extraordinary job. They do a lot of it essentially for free. They do it in the evening. They do it to take time away from everything else they need to do. So the simple story is there's just more of everything to do. But from your perspective, at the end of the day, local government and regional district is local government. The buck stops with you. The service needs to be supported by you to provide that service. And our recommendation is, and based on so many departments we work with, for those 2, we need to step them up because there is an awful lot to be done to assure the taxpayers and the residents that they're getting the service that they need.
Can I also add that it's a natural evolution as departments grow, as they serve a larger population base, as they take on more complex calls and provide a wider range of emergency response services, that it's a natural evolution to move in from a pure volunteer or a paid-on-call chief to the career chief, which then provides you with that central figure around which you build out the department. Chief Higgs could talk about this in terms of the evolution of the Sechelt department, where you started with the career chief and then you slowly build into a composite department as the call volumes increase, as the requirements increase. And it's one way to ensure that you're able to manage all of the requirements in a way that is safe and effective. So it's a natural evolution in terms of the development in these departments.
So to summarize, it's a maturing of the community.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Director Seegers?
Thank you. Thank you for the very extensive report. It was long reading, but it was very
Good reading.
It was very informative.
Good.
As you know, Sechelt does not pay into this function, but because our firefighters in Sechelt, our fire department, has a mutual aid agreement, what happens on the rest of the coast impacts Sechelt, and vice versa, right? So I have some questions around this. The playbook, the municipal district here, or the regional district here, actually is the one that sets the level that each fire department has to attain or has to provide service they have to provide under the playbook. What is the level of service? I didn't read the playbook in detail this time. I did last time when it actually came forward a few years back. What is the level that we've actually identified each department to be at? Do we know?
They are mostly full service and one exterior, I think.
One exterior, the rest interior?
Actually, so you have full service in Gibsons.
Yes.
You have interior in Roberts Creek, interior in Half Moon Bay, and exterior in Egmont.
Okay.
And Egmont is supported very closely by Pender Harbour, which is, I think, a full-service department.
So what you've indicated in there is that this board has identified that they are to be interior.
Correct.
In Roberts Creek and Half Moon Bay, yet the training identified or recorded for the firefighters doesn't actually indicate that they have documented that training. They may have it, but it's not been documented. So while we've said they are to be at that level, we haven't provided them with the tools to be able to demonstrate that they have that.
This is part of the support that is required.
Yes.
On the administrative side to make sure that the records can be properly managed and properly created. And to be honest, Wayne and I are both living on the coast. I'm actually quite comfortable now, having done the review, that we've got really good fire services here. And what you need to do, and that's part of the process that's mapped out here, is to improve both the training and the recording of the training as you go forward. I think we're pretty comfortable that they are operating appropriately, and it's just a matter of getting the documentation in order to back that up, and to improving, doing some bridging of gaps that may have been identified in the report. I would also point out that there is nothing unusual in this report compared to the 100 or so other fire department reports and reviews that we have done. And in fact, your departments are operating at a pretty good level, like a very comfortable level in terms of their professionalism and in terms of their training levels and management at the senior officer level.
Right. Oh, I understand that. Another issue that you talked about, though, is retention and recruitment. So you talked about using different colors, for example, on the firefighters' gear or equipment or whatever, so that there's automatically a recognition across the board by everybody on site as to the level of training that somebody has, so they won't be put in a situation that could be, they just couldn't.
Indeed.
Right. Yes, that's right.
You don't want anybody driving beyond their headlights, and you want, it's 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter, and you've called out mutual aid. You want to be able to readily identify the training and qualifications, the proficiency of all of the members who are appearing from other departments. Part of that is done and Wayne can talk your ears off about incident command, but part of it is done by making sure that the incident command systems are functioning appropriately, so that the incident commander is getting the support from the mutual aid commander in a way that allows them to identify that these people are qualified to make an interior attack, these people are exterior only. But you're right, part of it is to formalize it from the perspective of the board. By having your fire departments formalize it and ensure they have the processes in place, it provides protection to the fire department. It also provides protection to the board. You're fulfilling your obligations as the authority having jurisdiction. And that is something that we recommend be made consistent across all 6 departments. So you need to coordinate with Pender Harbor and with the Sechelt department, because of course, they're mutual aid partners, automatic aid partners. You want to make sure everybody is working on the same system.
Right. Okay, I have more questions, but I'll... Yes.
Another point there is to bear in mind that the difficulty for these chief officers is to ensure that they have the right level of training across the board as is required by the level of service which you have decided upon. That's extremely difficult to achieve and maintain. It takes a huge amount of time and therefore cost. And it's important for 2 reasons. One is to ensure the service to your community is at the level you want it to be, so that the taxpayers get what they deserve, if you will, but also to ensure that the firefighters go home safely at the end of the day.
Definitely.
The safety is paramount, and so without all of that being in place, at the end of the day, the homeowner may not get quite the level of service they thought they were going to get. That's one thing, but you've compromised the well-being and safety of the people who volunteered, in essence, stepped forward to say, I will protect my community. So it becomes a real critical issue, and then when you throw mutual aid into it, it becomes much more complex. So for one of these gentlemen to run the incident ground with all of those variables is difficult, and so they don't have all their people trained to the levels they want, I'm sure, and they would like to do so, and they need to do so, because on any given night, you don't know who's going to show up. So I can't overemphasize that enough. It's hugely important.
Yeah, I understand that.
Once that level has been set, you need to get it and stick to it and stay with it, and that's hard to do. It takes a lot of time.
So in the report, you talk a lot about the playbook and the training, et cetera, and the various levels. One of the things that's happened in the last number of years is the first medical responders, right? That's something that inside of the ambulance service, et cetera, a lot of that has now fallen to the fire departments. Where does that training come? Where do they get that training? How is that provided? I didn't see anything about that in the documentation.
It's actually not directly related to the playbook. And first medical response is treated as an optional service for fire departments, even if it's a critical one. And I think that it is part of what, if a department, in consultation with the authority having jurisdiction, has agreed to enter into the indemnity agreement with Emergency Health Services and to start providing first medical response, then it is part of your contractual obligation with EHS that you have to meet certain specified training requirements. And the chief officers know what those training requirements are, and if they're going to do FMR, they build that in, and it has to do with certain base training and certain how many times you get out and actually get to exercise it, and then how much refresher training you have to do. But you have a contract between the authority having jurisdiction and Emergency Health Services where you commit to ensuring that your members are trained to that level to meet their requirements under the agreement. Okay?
So I think it's important then to recognize that the playbook simply regulates the requirements for structural firefighting.
Right.
Anything you choose to provide to the community beyond that, such as medical response, auto extrication, wildfire response, you name it, technical rescue, water rescue, whatever you want to provide is over and above the requirements of the playbook, which requires additional training, additional complexities, and of course more time. So the minute you say we want to be able to do this, that, and the other thing, it just makes their jobs bigger, bigger, and bigger.
And you take on those jobs because you have a service you need to provide to your community. Part of the coordination that can occur across the 6 departments, for example, is that you can allow one department to specialize in certain of the technical responses, maybe hazmat, maybe one department specializes in hazmat, because usually your response is on a hazmat call, you've got more time, and you can take, the fact that it occurs up in Pender Harbor, if the Sea Shelf department is trained, they have the time to get up there. Certain of the technical rescue skills, again, you could maybe have specialized in one department, and then they just provide the response up and down the coast. And that is something that I think your chief officers, they can get together with one of the reasons we're recommending this manager of protective services is to help coordinate that kind of thinking and to make sure that the services are properly designated and shared, people are trained to them, and you know where it's available and how you can bring it in when required.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, in terms of the statistics that were presented in terms of the number of the call volumes and the increasing call volumes, what percentage of those call volumes, what is increasing the most, the non-fire calls or the fire calls? What aspect is increasing the most?
Mostly everything goes up. One of the things that we see a higher incidence in, and it's something I've discussed with the chiefs in previous years I've done, their statistics is in fact what turn out to be false alarms or monitored alarms. And so I think a number of the departments have taken some initiative in terms of the fire inspection to go and try and tune those down, because there is no fire there, they create an emergency response that should be avoided if we can. So that's one that I think in many cases has declined because they've done some proactive work on it. But we see first medical response, we see motor vehicle accidents, we see reports of fires all going up. They go up at different rates, Chair, but there's a myth sometimes. People think that fires are going down and that's why fire departments want to go to medical calls. That's simply not true. Fires are up in every department we've looked at, throughout all the departments. They continue to increase because we have more houses, we have more complexity in them. So they increase at variable rates, and I can provide a more detailed response to you if you like. I don't want to do it off the top of my head to get it wrong, but we have the data for absolutely everything, and we can provide all of that.
That's because we're very aware on the coast here that with the highway, we get a lot of highway accidents, a lot of accidents that the fire department is the first response to. And so they're providing that service along Highway 101, I guess on with an agreement that we provide that service. But it's one of those areas that is very specialized in terms of response.
It is, and it is it presents a significant set of risks as well, depending on the size and type of the vehicle. So where once upon a time vehicles were much simpler, today they have multiple battery systems in, they have different energy systems, they have to be deconstructed at the scene in a particular way so as not to create an increased level of risk for the person in the vehicle, but for the firefighters as well. And so the fire chiefs will tell you about the care and concern they have to take when they in fact do vehicle extrication. With modern vehicles, they are a much more complex thing.
One more.
Director Seegers?
Training facility. I noticed that you've indicated that each of them requires additional training, setups, etc., at their sites. I mean, yes, some people look at the Sunshine Coast as, very, very long distances to drive. Those of us who have lived other areas or go other areas realize this is really a small place. How much of that would need to be on site, and how much of it could actually be amalgamated into one site for all of them to use?
There's a couple of levels there, and I'll ask Wayne to talk about that. But the Sechelt Department has built quite a nice training site. But if we think about Cal's department, about Egmont, if they send the engine and the crew down there, then there's nobody in Egmont for the call that will occur. So they will go there perhaps for more specialized training and arrange for another department to provide backfill. But Wayne, you want to talk about the training and how it can be, there's site-specific for the hall, and then there's more regional ones.
I think Dave painted pretty much the picture that there's initial training and then there's the maintenance of that training. That can be done locally at the local fire hall. So there has to be enough props, equipment, and site to enable them to do so. The more specialty and the more complex training issues where they get into scenario-based situation training where you need more apparatus, more people, more space, more complex training, then you need a more central site. Those are things they're not going to do weekly. Those are things they're going to do periodically throughout the year. So I think you need a real good combination of the both. You do need a central site to provide them the opportunity to do all the complex stuff, but they need to be able to weekly do the maintenance work. And some of the departments lack enough space or facilities to do so.
Thank you. The directors, any other questions? Yep. Director Hiltz?
Yes. Thanks, Chair Beamish. Yeah, a couple of questions. Just to follow up on the statistics that was on page 106, where all the incidences and alarms ringing and illegal burning. So just a little bit of details on alarms ringing and what illegal burning is.
Well, these are the way they're reported to us in the data set we get. So alarms ringing are, there's any number of private monitoring companies that will monitor an alarm for you, and they report it as a fire alarm ringing at a particular building, more often a commercial premise than a residential premise. But the fire department has to treat that as a signal that there's a fire there until proven differently. And so you'll usually see a higher number of alarms ringing in an area that's more commercial, that has more commercial. So, for example, Gibson's has a much higher commercial area. They're going to naturally have more of those ones. And some of them, the systems are older. Going too deeply here, but the batteries are not well maintained or the contacts are not well maintained. And an awful lot of alarms ringing calls are, in fact, false for one or more reasons. Not so very often malicious false alarms. They're, in fact, technically false because something is corroded or something jiggles or some such thing happens. So we see the distribution of them like that. Again, I put that graphing on page 106, page 98 in the report, 106 in your package to show you again that the departments are different, right? It's not one size fits all, and so you can see some departments are busy with one type of call, and some are busy with other types of calls. You can see MVIs being a much higher occurrence in some places. Roberts Creek, I think they win the gold star for MVIs because they've got a long stretch of road where people somehow manage to go off the road and hit other things, whereas other areas don't. So the coast is a very rich tapestry from Gibson's, from Langdale, and right up to Egmont. It changes a lot, and so the responses change a lot by department. They change by month. They change by by hour of the day. So there's a complex set of reasons for why they go up and they go down, but some of them are fairly straightforward. And the alarms ringing is one for sure, and the MBI ones is clearly related to highways that people, I'm astonished, they go over the speed limit from time to time in the dark and the rain, and so you do get more MBIs, and the Roberts Creek Department has become particularly expert at those calls.
And the illegal
Illegal burning, that is people who they burn when they shouldn't be burning, but it will often cause a response to the department, and they will go there and chat with the person and try and get them to not do it again. But they usually occur a little bit in the fall of the season or in the spring of the season. Hopefully not in the high fire season in the summer, and very seldom in the wintertime.
So a career fire chief, again, would be a place that they can do more prevention, the inspections, and maybe get these numbers down in some ways.
Well, that's always our advice. We would like all of the call volumes to go down, because every one of them represents some amount of misery. A structure fire, an FMR call, that's somebody having some particular kind of misery. Illegal burning is irritating, but it draws you away from everything else that you should be doing. Alarms ringing, until you get there and determine that it's not a real call, we have to consider that it is. And so you're now unavailable for something else that can occur at that time. So that's one of the real reasons to do that as well. And so as you ramp up and add some more career staff, you can focus on these, what really become hotspot issues. When you look at the data, you can say to yourself, on this particular day, we seem to have a problem with your alarm system, so we're going to go there and deal with it. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Director Pratt.
Thank you. Thank you for the comprehensive report and all of the reading material. It's great to get the scope of what's going on. I think this is a question more for staff, though. Mr. Mitchell had indicated that he does provide the stats to all of the fire chiefs, even for the improvement districts, and I'm wondering if and when the board would be seeing any of the information for all of the departments, if that's something that could be brought forward.
CEO.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So that is something certainly that we can look to coordinate when the statistics are available and bring them back for information for the committee, certainly.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say that when I do that with the contracted work I provide for EGOV, and that's done at no cost to the agencies. I'm more than happy to provide that. And again, we also provide it to Seashelt and to Pender Harbor, which are independent. Yeah. It's theirs to share if they wish. I don't share it across the universe, but provide it to each of them. Yeah. And again, it's a no-cost thing, and they're welcome to share it across the group as they wish.
Thank you. Director Hiltz.
I'll defer to Ties and Director Ties, and if we can come back for one last.
Director Ties.
Okay, thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank staff and the previous board for choosing to use Dave Mitchell and Associates to do these two reports that we're going through today. And then I'd also like to commend Dave Mitchell and Associates for two very fine reports that have been very well received all around from what I hear. I also, so what I want to highlight is more of a question to staff, and that's on page 5 in here. And it says here, the primary concern is the need to fill the 3 roles, that being the 2 career chiefs and the manager of protective services, and to ensure that gap in emergency and first responder services is limited and mitigated for community safety reasons. There's a commitment to include and keep the Roberts Creek and Half Moon Bay volunteer fire members informed throughout the recruitment process. As well, there's a recognition that any recruitment process will take time to complete. So as I understand, the recruitment process is well underway, and that's great. My question to staff mostly is to what level have volunteers been engaged up to this level, and what are the future plans for engagement? Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regards to the recruitment process, The steps that we follow are basically to start with creating a job description that incorporates the qualifications and requirements associated with the role. We went through that process, actually had a discussion with all of the chiefs at a recent meeting to sort of validate the contents. In terms of the steps that we followed, I can actually refer back to what we did when we had a vacancy in the Gibsons Fire Department for the chief position. We actually posted a job, went out and actually had a meeting with the staff, talked to them about the process that we would be following so that they were reassured that we had everyone's best interest in mind. The volunteer members were in attendance at that meeting, and the expectation is we'll do exactly the same thing with Roberts Creek.
Director Theis?
Yeah, so I guess my question is since the position's already been posted, has any kind of consultation occurred with the volunteers and kind of kept them informed on this matter? And then and I'm also curious as to how you're going to in what way the volunteers are going to have a say in the selection of that new chief, because this is a big change in governance for these these volunteers. I just want to make sure that they're happy, because we want these volunteers to continue to be volunteering, and it's a big burden on them to be doing this, and we just want to make sure that they're happy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. That is a shared goal. That's actually one of our primary concerns and our primary considerations. We recognize how important this role is, and we want to make sure that whatever steps are followed, we not only don't do anything to hurt or damage the relationship with the volunteers, we actually want to enhance it. We recognize the value that they bring. So the discussions we've had, the preliminary discussions we've had, have included having a member sit on the hiring panel so that they are involved in the process. The preliminary discussions, I understand, primarily took place with the officers. I'm not sure to what extent those discussions occurred with members. But with regards to the work that was done in the creation of the report, that's my understanding, is that through the chief and the discussion with the officers that there was some dialogue that did occur. But going forward, that would be the expectation, is we would look to include somebody on the selection panel.
Director McMahon.
Yes, it's not my question, but I'll echo what Director Theis said, because I was buttonholed by a firefighter this morning on the way here. So, the volunteers are very concerned about this, and they want to be included. And that's really got to be an important part of the process. This report, as I see it, focuses primarily on staffing and call volume, the reasons for the staffing. There's mention of, needs in terms of facilities, but we don't see yet sort of a long-term plan for facilities replacement. And I also don't see addressed the question of whether we would extend the fire boundaries. It seems to me that came up regarding Area F, extending the fire boundaries. That would have a big impact on the fire departments, and I guess that's a question for staff. Was there a report or some consultation going on that?
CAO?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So to answer the question, so once the strategic plan, the committee adopts the strategic plan, the recommendations that are on page 1 do really focus on the staffing, and that is related to the current vacancies and or pending retirements, and ensuring that we have adequate continuous service. The rest of the recommendations, which there are a total of 45 recommendations, which they're quite substantive, and staff are recommending that we come back with service plans, and this would be consistent with what we're doing with our other departments, infrastructure, planning, community development, those sorts of things, where we look at those service plans would in fact act as implementation plans, and realizing that we can't achieve all of the 45 recommendations in 1 year. It would not be feasible, but over a period of time we would prioritize those. And that's where the consultation, again, with the various fire departments as they relate to the recommendations that pertain to them also would be incorporated. So that's the mechanism that we're looking to implement. So there will be lots more dialogue over the next of your term related to the implementation of this fire plan, of the strategic fire plan.
Director Beaman?
Yes, I also wanted to flag in the report where it said that fire insurance ratings take into account available water supply. This is something I think that we need to bear in mind as a board. It says water supply system including source to distribution analysis, redundancy factors, condition and maintenance of various components, and storage volume.
Director Hiltz?
One last question for me. This is on page 107. It's the what they're called fire hall areas. Yes. And I think this is following up a little bit with Director McMahon and fire hall area 03. It talks about a future fire hall. So I'm just kind of wondering about the stats from what areas fire hall area, Gibson's fire hall area 3, and a little bit about what you know about the future fire hall.
It wasn't in the scope of the report, but there has always been a plan on paper to say at some point in time they might need a fire hall on the north side of Gibson's. It hasn't come to any fruition yet, but when the system was set up for dispatch, it was the decision of the chief at the time, Bob Stevens, to say, well, let's divide it area into 3 areas so we can start to track what the statistics look like. The response numbers for it are really quite low, and I think that shows up on the following page. If you look at page 108 or page 100 of our report, you can see the Gibson's Fire Hall 3. There's very few calls there, and those are the ones that are still within the protected area, but north of a certain line. And I won't go off memory as to where the line is, but it was in fact Chief Stevens said, listen, let's at least draw it out so that we have a basis to track the statistics. As you can see, there's not a lot of calls there.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
And Director Seegers.
Thank you. I don't have any questions, but once we get to the recommendations, I'd like to talk about one of them. Thank you.
Director Ties.
So I just have one more question, and once again, this is staff, and that's that there are a lot of recommendations that come out of these 2 reports, and I know from my corporate history that often when somebody gets somebody to give you a report and says these are our recommendations, the big disconnect is usually between getting those recommendations and then executing on them. I'm sure that is not the case here, but nevertheless, I'd like to see if, I'm wondering if there's any sort of plan to create an implementation plan of these recommendations, and who would be the person head manning that, and then I would assume it's probably the new manager of protective services, and then will we get a follow-up report on the implementation of all these recommendations?
CAO.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. I'm going to highlight the last recommendation that's on page 1, and that is, in effect, the mechanism and the tool that we use here at the regional district to create the service plans. And in that service plan, there would also be discussions on the priorities and also how it relates to the budgets and the impacts that also would relate to the resourcing that would require. So I understand you haven't seen a service plan yet. These are the first opportunities that you're going to be seeing them. You will be seeing them with all the other services that we have at some point, but this is the tool to make sure that these recommendations don't sit on a shelf and that they are implemented over a period of time, realizing that it's not feasible to do everything all in a couple of months. So that's the answer to it. So.
Thank you. Director McMahon?
I'm just, I don't know if this is the right process thing to do, but I'm going to suggest that we take the recommendations separately.
I was going to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And all questions being out there now, so I guess my one comment is a couple comments is it is a comprehensive report, and I appreciate that. I've worked in a number of small communities where the volunteer fire departments are very underappreciated and very underrespected, and that except when there's a fire, and then suddenly everybody wonders where everybody is, and it's holiday time, or somebody's gone fishing, or it's Christmas, and there's no control or no requirement for volunteers to stay in town, and so having an organized fire department is actually a luxury from some of my past experience. I'm reminded of a picture in the one of the northern papers last year of a fire in the community that I was working in, where somehow the tanks that the firemen were wearing were upside down and not turned on. Yet these guys were around, and they had no ability to go inside and fight a fire. They actually had some training up there that was delivered to them for fighting fires at airports. And I said to the trainers, "You really expect our guys to go onto airplanes?" And they said, "Well, we don't expect them to, but they will, because there's going to be their friends and neighbors on the plane." And I said, well, then we're not giving them the right kind of training. And so there's a lot involved in terms of firework, and I appreciate that. I am going to look at the recommendations. I recommend we deal with them one at a time. And I guess the bigger question I have, and that's for staff, is to the CAO, is that we are going into our own strategic planning session as of tomorrow. And this is obviously part of the strategic planning for the regional district. And are we moving ahead of our process in terms of that by approving this strategic plan or aspects of this strategic plan? Or should we actually include this in our discussion over the next 2 days as to how we address this component of strategic planning? To the CAO.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So with respect to the strategic planning exercise with the fire departments, it has been undertaken for some time now. It's actually been a couple of months. And so it was identified with the fire chiefs collaboratively and with the board supporting doing this. So staff would recommend that we move forward with moving this particular strategic plan forward. It does relate to a set of fire departments, which is one service within all of the services that the regional district provides, and so it should be considered alongside all of the other plans that the regional district have. There are many plans that we have, and this would be one of them. So. Staff are given the work, given the time that everyone has put into this, we are recommending moving forward with it today.
Yeah, and I guess my thought is just that given the time simultaneously that we're moving forward with strategic planning, this appears to be just slightly ahead of that.
Yeah, I realize the timing of those two things would look like that. In fact, this had started many months ago and just relates to a particular service within the regional district, as opposed to the overarching strategic direction and plan that the board will set. It will be much broader.
Now, there are different recommendations here, and one of the things, I guess, again, moving ahead of the process slightly, and that the fourth recommendation on this page is to present this strategic plan to the town of Gibson's. as a representative of the town of Gibson's, I'm somewhat uncomfortable in moving ahead of the rest of my council before they receive the strategic plan and have a chance to consider it. And that's one of the challenges I have, that I'd be making decisions ahead of a presentation to our own council in that sense. So that's the challenge there. And I'd rather almost see that the presentation to the town of Gibson be made before I'm asked to vote on the plan that is delivered to them, because it's a fait accompli when they receive it at that point in time. However, the first recommendation that's there is that recommendation number 1 of the SCRD, recommendation 1 in part of the SCRD Fire Department strategic plan, through attrition of current positions of Roberts Creek and Half Moon Bay Fire Departments, the vacancies be transitioned to career fire chiefs. The board have a mover of that recommendation? Director McMahon, seconded by Director Ties. Discussion? Director McMahon?
Yes, that is the recommendation to me that seems to have some urgency attached to it. And I see a good argument for having more staff hours simply available, because the demands of the job are obviously really high. And I can see the challenges with the record keeping also, that this is something we need to move forward on. So this is the one of these recommendations that I think that we could move forward right now. In regard to the next recommendation, we haven't even received the report
It's not
on
the
that
table
recommendation.
yet,
Yes. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Director Ties.
So yeah, as Stu said, that first recommendation I also supported, and I believe the volunteer chiefs have also, and the fire departments have voiced their support in regards to moving those 2 positions to career chiefs. I just want to reiterate that it is paramount that the volunteers are closely involved in this process, and that every effort should be made to make sure that our volunteers are happy throughout this whole transition process. Thank you.
Okay, see no further mics on. Call the question. All in favor? Resolution number 1? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. A second recommendation is that, as per recommendation 4 of the SCRD Fire Department strategic plan, a manager protection services position be created from the existing emergency program coordinator vacancy, and that this position report to the chief administrative officer. Board, what's your wishes with this recommendation?
I'd like to speak to it first.
Director Seegers.
Thank you. So I have a couple of concerns about this. One is the way this is presented here, it's indicating that only areas A, B, D, E, F, and Gibsons are voting on this, and yet the funding for this position would actually be from emergency funds, emergency program funds, which is a function of every member of the board. So I don't believe that it's set up properly here. As well, in the next report, under the emergency program services review, it actually identifies that we are to look at redefining or identifying what the position should be for the emergency program coordinator. So I think this is premature. If a position, if the rural directors would like to vote on hiring somebody for the position to manage the fire services, they're welcome to do that. But I don't have direction from my council, and I don't see that we actually have the information required to fulfill the position as it's laid out here, and the voting structure hasn't been identified properly.
Thank you. Would somebody like to move the recommendation? Okay, that recommendation is not. Oh, Director Hiltz?
Yeah, I'd like to discuss that a little bit. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yes, I think it's worth discussing the
Okay.
relevance of that recommendation.
You'll move the recommendation?
I'll move the
Okay.
recommendation.
Second it? Director Ties? Okay, the motion's on the table. Discussion. Yeah. Who would like to speak to it? Director McMahon?
As I previously said, we haven't even received the emergency services report yet. So I think it's premature to discuss the recommendation until we look at the other report.
Any other discussion? Director Hills?
I'd like to hear the recommendation. The motion is to move this to another area or defer it, or?
No, the motion exists right now, is on the table, as read. There's no amendment to that motion, and it's been moved and seconded.
Listening to Director Seegers and Director McMahon, it does seem to be premature. I would agree with that. Maybe staff has something to say about why it's in here rather than in another report.
CAO?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So certainly there's a recognition there. The recommendation originally arrived through the consultation in developing the strategic plan. So and that's where the work initially started. The second report followed in conjunction with the strategic plan. So that's where we started. So certainly by moving this recommendation or deferring it to consideration in the second report would be appropriate. And just to confirm, the allocation is it's a regional service, so everyone does pay into the service.
And I guess my comment to it again is that this appears to be a fundamental change in direction relative to the emergency plan, emergency program as well, and not continue with the emergency coordinator position that we have had and is currently vacant. And once again, I'm uncomfortable discussing that, making a decision on that without having to discuss that or get direction from Gibson's Council. And anticipating that this is going to be presented to Gibson's Council, I'd certainly like to see it flow from that conversation as well as part of the bigger picture of how the emergency program is going to be addressed. Director Seegers?
Thank you. And the position, given that we're funding as well,
Yes.
would need to come to the District Sechelt Council.
Yes. So the motion's on the table. Is there a motion to defer that this time? Oh. Yeah. Director Pratt, Director McMahon. All in favor of deferral? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the third motion, that the staff and our consultant present the strategic plan to the town of Gibsons. I would appreciate that. As a representative of the town of Gibsons, I would make that motion. Somebody second that? Director McMahon. All in favor? Approved. And final, that the 3-year service plans for each of the SCRD fire departments be developed and brought back to the committee for consideration. Somebody make that motion. Director Pratt, Director Ties, all in favor? Questions, or Director Seeger?
So I guess if we're looking at a 3-year service plan, if the position wasn't actually put in place, who would actually do this?
CAO?
Thank you. So at the end of the day, any service plan that we have will be developed through a team approach. We would have finance, we would have legislative, we would have a number of people helping to provide inputs alongside the fire departments themselves. So we will, implementing a service plan is a best practice for regional districts, and so I recommend that we still move forward. I will be responsible for having to task out that.
Director McMahon?
Yes. How does the Gibsons District Fire Commission relate to all of this?
That's a good question. Do we still have the Gibsons District Fire Commission?
Yes, we do.
So I'm going to end two parts. So yes, it still exists, and yes, there were board appointments very recently, so I will ask our consultants also if you have anything else, but it could also be a separate recommendation should the committee wish to refer it to that. So you are now referring it back to the town of Gibsons and to the Fire Commission.
Yes.
Should you wish to do that, but yes, it does exist.
Okay. Okay, we'll follow that up when we have further discussion of the strategic plan. We talk about the town of Gibsons. In this case here, the fire department represents Area E and Area F and the town of Gibsons, so that I would certainly invite the directors to that meeting when that occurs. So vote on the final motion, the 3-year service plans. All in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, motion passes. Thank you very much for that report. And we have the resolutions on that. Now we want to move on to the next report. Same presenters? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And this is the next item on the agenda is the item 3, the Chief Administrative Officer, the SCRD Emergency Plan Review, introduction by Dave Mitchell and Associates, and we have the report as attachment C to the board.
He's going to get the right PowerPoint.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chair Beamish. So
Chair.
we do have a couple of slides here to introduce the report, and Mr. McDonald will to speak to that.
Thank you.
So again, just in terms of sequencing while staff are helping to set up the presentation, is that we did initiate the strategic planning exercise with the fire departments, and out of that came some recommendations that worked in concert with the emergency plan review, and so that is why Dave Mitchell and Associates were able to help us as well. And I'm sure Mr. McDonald will outline how he's also helped many regional districts and local governments across BC with these types of reviews as well.
Sorry, could I just ask a question? On my agenda, I've got, that's attachment C. My apologies. I'm looking at something that's old and out of date. So, Annex B. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name's Ian McDonald, and as Dave mentioned, I'm the recovering lawyer in the group. As part of our fire service reviews, we always review emergency program planning to see how the fire service gets integrated into the emergency planning. Since from local government's perspective, your fire departments are actually the only emergency response service that you directly control. And so it's critical to make sure that they're properly integrated. So we've done emergency program reviews pretty much for every regional district that we have worked with. We look at it from the fire service perspective. This was somewhat different in the sense that we were asked to go in more deeply to actually review the form of your program. And so first slide shows sort of what the review constituted. We worked through the statutory and regulatory requirements that underpin your emergency program, Emergency Program Act, the regulations. There's a recent Auditor General on local government report on emergency planning that came out in 2018, and it goes into some detail about the concerns at the provincial level about how local government is managing its emergency planning. And so we've integrated that into the memorandum structure as well. We did a detailed review of your program's bylaw structure, so the legal basis under which you have created your coast-wide emergency program. And I would say that the approach is best practice. You guys have adopted best practice in having integrated all of the communities on the coast into a single emergency program. In my view, is best practice because it ensures that regardless of where the emergency occurs, you have the resources, you have the integration necessary in order to respond to it. So conceptually, it is very good. We'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation, and they've kept me in a very short presentation, probably wise. We'll talk a little bit more about the bylaw structure and some updating that is probably necessary. We reviewed the 2017 form of your emergency program. That's the version that is on the website and that is currently active in terms of all of your partners. That's the version that they are working from. And we did that review against a half dozen precedents from other regional districts and other local governments that we have worked with, so we could provide guidance to staff when it comes time to update. When they sit down to update it, they will have other versions that they can look at in order to draw on best practice from other jurisdictions. We conducted interviews with senior staff at the SCRD, your CAO, finance, human resources, admin, and legislative, and with Chief Michael, who is your emergency program coordinator pro tem. And we integrated the review into our reviews, obviously, with your 4 fire services to make sure that they understood how the emergency program worked and what role they play in its activation and notification of an emergency that they are dealing with that might lead to an EOC activation or the gearing up of ESS or other support services. In terms of major issues, and I'll talk at a high level here and go into more detail on a couple of these points. The form of the plan itself needs some updating. It was originally drafted in 2009, and it has kind of wandered along a bit, and it needs some tightening up. One thing that you need to think about conceptually is you need to design your program so it's not dependent on any single individual. And this is critical. You need to make sure that you have bench strength in terms of your ability to implement and operate your emergency program, to activate your EOC, to have an emergency response in a major incident where maybe your most senior member was hit by the proverbial bus or is off the coast on a vacation or something and is just not available to you. You need to be able to ensure that you've got bench strength to actually run the program regardless of missing 1 or 2 people. You have to have strong, well-developed relationships with your volunteers. They are critical. It's interesting because we were, as part of this work, we also were working with one of the senior guys in Vancouver who is updating the Vancouver emergency program, and they're dependent. The city of Vancouver is highly dependent on its volunteer resources. The coast, it's even more so. I mean, if you think about it, you've got your ESS, you've got your radio, you've got SARS, so search and rescue, and all of your fire services. These are all pretty much volunteers, right? So you've got to make sure you've got these well-developed relationships with them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You're going to need to update your supporting bylaw structure, and I'll come back to that. And you need to ensure that, and this comes out of the AGLG report, you need to ensure that each participating local authority, so Sechelt, Gibsons, SIGD, and the SCRD itself, have all developed coherent business continuity plans. And in talking to the SCRD, I think it's fair to say that it's a work in progress. There are some areas of the SCRD's operations where the business continuity planning is actually quite well advanced, so your IT systems and things like that are actually pretty well thought out, but that as a holistic matter, it is an area that needs more attention and focus. And this is something that I think, again, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Seegers, you can take back to your respective councils and have the discussion as to where you're at in terms of business continuity planning. And again, in the same way that your emergency program itself is coordinated on the coast, your business continuity planning also should be coordinated. So one of the things you could be looking at, for example, is making sure that your IT systems are better integrated and are mutually backed up so that you can run the systems from any one of the locales. That would just be one example of the kind of continuity planning that could be incorporated into this. In terms of the program's bylaw structure, and I worked through that in some detail, and I've spoken with the SCRD's legislative representative on this. It has gotten out of date a bit, and there are a number of technical issues that I've identified, just where terminology has wandered apart and where the same position is called different things by different bylaws. And I think it would be useful to sit down, get the collection of bylaws together, update them as a single whole, and bring them into bring them up in a coordinated fashion. One area where the program itself, the program bylaw itself, has specified a process and some detail about how committees will function, and the actual way the program has been working for the last 8 or 9 years. I think that committee structure actually is defunct. It hasn't been functioning. And so my recommendation as you go forward would be to look at that, decide how you want the program to run, and update your bylaws accordingly. And one approach you can take is to give the SCRD permission to establish those kinds of committees, but not make it mandatory. And then as practice changes or as your needs change, if you need to create a committee, you can create it, but it doesn't become a mandatory thing when the committee wasn't functioning well, apparently. So it's something that's one of the biggest changes that I think you need to review as you update the bylaw structure. The plan itself is showing its age. It was originally drafted in 2009. Some of the process issues need to be addressed, so that you need to formalize how plan updates are going to be managed, how it's going to be approved. Do the plan updates come back to the SCRD board for approval? It doesn't appear that was done. You need to have a coherent record of the revisions that have been made to the plan over time. This plan gets distributed to all of your partners on the coast, and that includes BC Ambulance, the RCMP, it includes people like Fortis and Hydro and TELUS, and you need to make sure that they are working with the most up-to-date version of your plan. And when they get a copy of the plan, they need to make sure that they have all of the supporting materials, which again are up-to-date and coherent for them. We've looked at the arrangement and structure of the plan, and we did that by comparison to the precedents. We're recommending that it be reviewed as you go through and update, and there are some places where it can be tightened up so that when it says EOC activation in the program itself, there's a more coherent discussion of how you actually activate the EOC, just minor things like that. And you can improve the layout. And these are things, I think the program or the plan has actually served you very well, and it's just time to refresh it. The supporting materials, they are quite comprehensive, but some of them are out of date, and some of them, and out of date in the sense that they were relevant when they were first put into the collection, but they've become less relevant over time. There's so much material there that, at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of winter, in the middle of an EOC activation, you don't want to have to be wading through material that you don't require. So you need to make sure that the supporting materials, first, that it tracks the way the plan itself is laid out, and second, that the materials are up to date and immediately relevant. We took a look at your training records, and they actually appear pretty good, but one of the things I would say is that I think the training needs to be more expansive. It needs to be spread out to make sure that staff in Sechelt, staff in the SIGD, staff in Gibsons are incorporated into the training processes. Again, that creates your bench strength, that makes sure that there's depth in terms of EOC activations. If you have an extended emergency, one that goes on not just for 2 or 3 days, but 2 or 3 weeks, you need to have a body of trained personnel to draw on. And this was a problem that we heard about when we worked with EMBC, and the first week or two of the provincial declaration of emergency all went great, but then they started to run out of bench strength because people time out. And that is a problem. That's something that you need to plan for. And so we've suggested that you have to have the training spread more broadly, and there needs to be a centralized record of that training. So in the same way that your fire departments need to know how each of the other members are trained, again, there should be a central training record kept for staff from Sechelt, staff from Gibsons, staff from Sechelt Indian Government District. The hazard, vulnerability, and risk assessments, those are the formalized assessments of where the risk points are on the coast, and they are quite comprehensive in nature, but they're now about 14 years old, and the coast has changed a lot in 14 years, having lived here for that length of time. And we've recommended that this be factored into your budget planning over the next sort of short to medium term, that you plan on updating these formalized risk assessments and bringing those materials into line with the way the coast is currently developed. One of the other things that it's not on this slide, but that I would note, that there are some other areas where we've recommended some more inquiries and more work be done. In particular on things like, we were talking about the problem of the highway being a scene of accidents. Well, our arterial road system on the coast is actually pretty limited. And there is a single point of failure at Chapman Creek, where the Chapman Creek Bridge were taken out for whatever reason, your north-south route is pretty much cut. So I think there needs to be some considered planning going into alternative routes. Are the Forest Service roads in shape to allow people, if they need to evacuate, to be able to use them? And if you are going to rely on Forest Service roads, that's going to actually generate an upkeep obligation, a maintenance obligation. It would generate a need to make sure, that you actually travel the route, and can somebody in a Toyota Prius actually get along the Grey Creek Forest Service road if they're trying to get out of Tawanek, okay? The other thing, obviously, some marine evacuation could be possible up the inlet if that is necessary, but you would need to have a clear understanding of the assets that are available and how you would manage that kind of an event. So it's something where, given our limited road network, I think more attention could be paid to evacuation routes. And so this is a timely discussion point. When we looked at the fire service needs and looked at the emergency program needs, and then at the practices in the other regional districts where they have created fire service coordinator positions and have an emergency program integrated with it, our recommendation was that you look at combining the two roles. And I know there are a lot of technical things that go on in terms of how you guys assess your positions. And as consultants, we don't need to worry as much about that. We let staff's role to have to sort that out. First thing is that the position itself probably should be an exempt role. Very broad authority granted to your emergency program coordinator, financial oversight of volunteers, hiring and firing of volunteers, resource activations. Certainly the practice in the other jurisdictions that we examined in connection with this, places like Kootenay Boundary and Central Kootenays, Fraser Fort George, they have exempt people who are in exempt role responsible for their emergency programs. We also recommended that you create that role as Dave indicated, manager of protective services, which covers both fire and the emergency program. And there's good reasons for that, because there's a natural integration between the fire services that you're operating, which are going to be your principal response agencies, and the operation of your emergency program. And so there's a natural connection there. One of the things that, obviously there's a lot of work to do. You've got a very long report on the fire services, and you've got a shorter report, but still lots of recommendations and some updating to do on the emergency program. It may be that, again, there's a recommendation in the report that a contract position be created to support the manager of protective services to make sure that the woodshed work gets done. You could then, at the expiry of that contract position, assess the workload, because you want to make sure that the emergency program continues to function appropriately and well. If it's more than a 1 FTE, you would be able to assess at the end of the contract position what additional assistance may be needed. And in terms of one of the things I sort of skipped over on the bylaw side, two of your fire departments obviously are operated by improvement districts. And one of the areas where we've suggested you review the structure is to formally incorporate those improvement districts into the emergency program itself. And it's not, to be honest, you guys have had activations. Sechelt Fire Department, obviously, when we had the fire up the coast here, it was all seamless because these guys function together all the time. They work together. They know what their roles are, and they work well. They work well as a group. but it's a bit of an oversight not to have the improvement districts formally included into the program itself. And my suggestion would be, improvement districts don't have to participate in emergency planning. They are not a local authority for the purposes of the Emergency Program Act. My suggestion is to use the Kootenay Boundary model. And Kootenay Boundary has got their emergency program laid out, and then underpinning the emergency program, they've created a standalone service agreement amongst all of the participants, so that it lays out everybody's role and function, clarifies process, clarifies involvement, clarifies responsibility. And so update your emergency program bylaws and then backstop it with a standalone agreement. And in that standalone agreement, you bring the improvement districts in so they are formal participants in the emergency program itself. Okay? And that takes me to questions. I think I hit my 15 minutes.
Half an hour ago.
As before I turn it over to the board for questions, I have a couple that just come to mind just from your presentation. Your first slide references who you consulted with. Were the volunteers consulted with?
Not formally. We met with ESS, actually with Chief Higgs on the ferry, and had a conversation with them.
Because your second slide mentions the importance of including the volunteers, and I'm just wondering how they were integrated in this discussion.
Well, this was actually a review of the form of your program and some of the substantive issues. So things like how you would actually go out and update it. I think that is where you bring them in as part of the update process.
Okay, that's just a question. Thank you.
Yep.
Motion to receive the report. Director McMahon, Director Pratt, all in favor? Thank you. Okay, now discussion. I'm sorry I jumped ahead of that discussion. So, discussion, questions, comments, board. Director McMahon.
Yes, it seems to me that we need to refer the report to other participants in this service, of which there are many, and also consult them, because this is a big, it is housed with the SCRD, so we have the ultimate responsibility for it, but we have to coordinate this with all of the other groups that participate on the coast.
It seems to me, it does not seem to me to be a resolution. Are you making a resolution or a recommendation to that effect, or further discussion? Yeah. Right.
Yes, I would like to move that we refer this plan to the improvement districts, District of Sechelt, Town of Gibsons, SIGD. Am I missing anyone?
Maybe comments from all the fire departments?
School District 46.
Which is in some sense the first recommendation, only broadening it to the first recommendation, the consultant staff or consultant present the emergency plan review to the 3 member municipalities and the Sunshine Coast Emergency Program Planning Committee, and there's additional ones you'd like to add to that. Yeah, being the
School district and Pender Harbor volunteer, fire improvement district and district of Sechelt improvement.
Yeah, the 2 improvement districts.
Improvement districts.
Yes, fire improvement districts.
There was a seconder for that? Director Seegers? Any discussion of that? I guess I would also like to see more discussion with the volunteer organizations at some level to be included in the discussion, so that in terms of that referral, how they get involved in that, to have an opportunity to review the report and to comment on it. Not sure how we do that, other than we include them in the discussion at the local level. Any comment, staff?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. I think through the SCEP committee, there'll be lots of volunteer organizations that will be connected to there, and if there is somebody that is not, we can certainly reach out to them and include them. But that would be a great place to use them as the coordinating body as well for review.
Director Seegers?
Thank you. Do we know who's on that planning committee? I haven't seen a list of who's on there. I don't know if that. I don't know who it includes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't actually know all the members, but I do know that it does include members that are involved with emergency support services, with the radio, with the hospital. All the fire chiefs are part of the process. BC Ferries is also there. I know the town of Gibson's is there. The district of Sechelt is there. Modi is there as well. Trying to think if there's others. RCMP, BCAS.
Okay. I think utilities as well. So Fortis, Hydro, TELUS. Pretty much the program, the committee covers everybody who would be a participant, a stakeholder, to whom you would be distributing the plan. So it actually does provide a very good forum for having that conversation.
Good. Okay, that sounds like exactly what we're looking to accomplish here. So thank you. So everybody understand that recommendation then, that this report be referred, and all in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Couple of questions. Okay, Director Seegers.
Thank you. A couple of questions about your report. One for staff. I know that inside of this report it talks about a contract position to assist with the transition as this moves forward. In this report and the previous one. In prior years, there was an executive administrator for the emergency program as a support. That person retired and it was not filled. Are there plans to fill that position, or what happened to that position?
CAO?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So that position, the person in that did retire, and it would have been in 2015. And that position had allocated a number of different things. This was one of the things that they were doing. It wasn't so through an allocation process, their time was split up. So that FTE in itself was not filled, and the duties of those of that FTE was spread amongst other staff, and created. So in fact, there were lots of other changes that were also happening. The community services department as a whole also changed through that process as well. So.
You mentioned about a central training record. If we're looking at having the municipalities and other organizations involved in it, then that should also be distributed as well to the others.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, everybody should share the training record, but it's critical that
yes.
as the entity that is operating the program, that the SCRD have a clear understanding of everybody who is trained, what their qualifications are, what duties and responsibilities they can be assigned in the event of an emergency activation.
Right, but as you were saying with the fire departments, they all need to have information, so this would need to be shared information as well. And then I think the rest is good. Thank you.
Okay, in terms of referring the report, are we also referring the additional 2 recommendations at this time? Any CAOs or any need to move on those at this time, or are they?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So the third recommendation around a budget proposal was just an opportunity that there were some things in the report that staff wanted to bring forward a recommendation through the budgeting process, where you see all of the budgets alongside in round 1, for consideration. It's up to the committee to decide whether you want to hold and wait for the first recommendation and to hear back from stakeholders before you proceed with the second one. But it was around. There are some things that are one-time tasks, if you will, such as updating our various bylaws here at the regional district, but also with our member municipalities. And so some of the resources aren't an ongoing resource requirement, but they are some of them are one-time resource requirements. So that was the opportunity through our budgeting process to consider that. Okay. But it's up to the committee whether they want to action that at this point. And then the last recommendation again speaks to just process in terms of seeing a balance of the recommendations through a service plan, and that would also follow the same pattern that we've done with the strategic fire department's plan. Is that there would be some prioritizing and some consultation with that, and then come back to committee. So the last two recommendations are process oriented.
Okay. Do you have a sense of how long it will take to do a further review consultation on the plan?
Not at this time,
okay.
But in terms of our 2019 budget process, it would be helpful before we move to into second round for sure.
And do we have a sense of the cost of some of those items that are contained in Section 5 and 6 that need to be considered in the budget process?
There has been some discussion, but it hasn't been pen to paper in terms of what that budget proposal would be, and that would follow process. We would first seek permission to do that and put that together. So this was not something that you saw in pre-budget, right?
Correct.
So that's why there is a separate recommendation there.
Yeah. So somebody would like to make a recommendation relative to at least doing the budget work, which would save some time overall. Director Pratt, Director Seegers, all in favor then of the resolution with respect to the Section 5 and Section 6 of the Emergency Plan Review to round 1 budget? All in favor? Okay, thank you. And the 3-year service plan be developed, brought back to the committee for consideration. That may be dependent upon the results of further review, I would think, would it not? Further discussion?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. It can work in both ways. It can work in tandem of what comes back from the consultation in terms of that, and can be incorporated into a service plan. But the concept of a service plan isn't that it's not static either, right? So it's an evolution over the years.
I'd like perhaps to refer that back with the earlier recommendation, so that so we don't move ahead of the process. That's all I'm thinking. So is everybody comfortable if we just leave that recommendation? That at this point it's not a resolution, it's a recommendation, and bring that one back as well at the same time as we further review. So, okay, well, Director Seegers.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just getting to the recommendations here that we've moved forward. So we were looking at the recommendations in Section 5 and 6. That's page 242 and 243 and 4 in our package. So clarification that was correct from staff? Yes? Okay.
It focused on those because they were seen as the legislative ones that we wanted to complete. But we also had considered other options should the committee also want to see those as well.
So one of the things that I don't see in here, and I might have missed it as I'm flipping through these quickly, is the actual job description for we're looking at postponing the other position at this point. We need to identify what the role of the emergency preparedness coordinator is in order to be able to revisit that. That's going to be a critical component, but I don't see that as a recommendation that's come forward. I did see it in here, but I can't find it now in this report. So I'm just trying to find where that recommendation was. There was a talk about making an exempt position, but there was also looking at a review of that position. I can't find it right now.
CAO?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. So that might be also a good opportunity to connect it back through round one budget, so that the job description and that position come back in consideration with the rest of the budget requests in round one, which is slated for February the 4th.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Anything on Director McMahon?
The previous report, did we refer it to the Fire Commission, Gibsonton District Fire Commission? We said that, but I don't think we actually, do we need to pass a motion? Sorry about that, I'm out of process.
Do you recall whether the Fire Commission was included in it? It wasn't included in that, so I think that
Do I need to make a motion? Can I make one?
you can make a motion.
Oh, wow. Okay. I move that we refer the fire report to the Gibsonton District Fire Commission.
Seconder? Director Pratt, all in favor? Okay. All right, thank you for that oversight. Okay, well, I think that that's all we're going to do today on that. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the work that you've put into this, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again. I don't know whether it's going to be yourselves or staff who will present to Gibson's, but we'll look forward to Gibson Council receiving a report. CIO?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Can staff confirm that there was a vote on the recommendations for the emergency program? I saw it was first and seconded.
Okay.
Can staff confirm that we did do that?
The first and second and that were both carried, and further that was not voted on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And we have other business to do. I'm going to ask the board's indulgence here. I know that we have on the agenda next coming up was the item 4, childcare. I'm going to suggest that we bring item 5 up ahead of item 4 because I know we have a contingent in the room on the Persephone, and some of them might actually like to get back to work. So that if that's okay, and thank you, Fire Chiefs, for coming. I appreciate meeting all of you this morning, and look forward to working with you. Thank you very much. So do I need a motion to amend the agenda to bring item 5 ahead of 4? Sorry. Yeah.
I was going to suggest that we could also move number 7, the frontage waiver, up after Persephone.
I think he's actually left. I don't know
he's
if
left? Okay.
Still in the room, but
All right.
Is he out in the hall there? Okay.
So.
Somebody can find him, but yeah, I don't have a problem with that either. If he's still here, so. Yeah, we'll have a motion then to reorder the agenda to that effect, if we could, please, to move items 5 and 7 up as the next 2 items to be addressed, and then followed by the child care. Okay, so item 5 being the Persephone, who's going to bring that forward? I'm sorry, yes. Have to have a motion. Director McMahon, Director Ties, all in favor? Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting hungry myself, so I'm jumping ahead of the process. Okay, so we have a report. Senior Planner, Sale? Yeah.
Chair Beamish?
Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry. Before we do this, I'm going to defer to Director Hiltz. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. In regards to item 5 is now the new item. I have a little bit of a statement that I would like to read and read it into the record. I'm advising the board of my connection with agenda item 5, development variance permit 00029, and the possible perception of bias or non-pecuniary conflict. As a resident of West House Sound, I submitted a letter in response to the referral process on May 7th, 2018, which is on page 281 of the agenda package. On September 6th, 2018, I appeared as a delegation before this committee, the PCD committee. Some details. My property is 100 meters from the property in this matter, and my home is 400 meters from the alcohol production facilities. I do not have a direct or indirect financial interest in the matter. I intend to take part in this agenda item with an open mind and fulfill my obligations of the oath of office I took on November 8th, 2018. That's just for consideration of the board and in light of transparency.
Thank you, Director Hiltz. Okay, refer now then to the planner. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. This report is a follow-up on a staff report presented to the board in September last year. That report provided a set of comprehensive recommendations on Persephone Brewing Company's development variance permit and endorsement applications for a food and beverage lounge and a picnic area. These recommendations support the variance permit subject to confirmation of the wastewater treatment systems, bicycle and vehicle parking requirements, and limits on operating hours. The lounge endorsement is also supported subject to limiting indoor seating to 65 and outdoor area to 50 square meters. And the picnic area endorsement is also supported subject to a limit of 150 people. Following the board's directive on that report, Persephone has since enhanced the already installed wastewater treatment system for the brewery facility, and the system is operating. This has been confirmed by both SCRD and Vancouver Coastal Health staff. The system is also certified by a qualified professional. Staff recommends support for these applications based on previous recommendations, with the additional condition that Persephone provides quarterly monitoring data of the wastewater treatment system for at least 1 year. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. Motion to receive the report. Director Pratt, Director Tyes, all in favor? Okay, discussion. Director Hiltz, you have a...
Sure, yeah. It's a great report, and staff has been working on it for a long time, and yeah, if there's questions, I have a couple proposed amendments or additions to the recommendations that we can do after the discussion.
Before we do that, is there any other discussion of the report? Director Seegers?
Thank you. I'm not somebody who votes on this, but I was very actually concerned about the limitation on the hours that were presented for operating and noise, given that those are laid out by other bodies, and we have a noise bylaw in the SCRD. So I'm wondering what was behind that, because we're looking at actually limiting the viability, basically, of this business in this area. So either staff or other directors potentially give some input on that.
Who would like to respond? Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. The hours proposed are in consideration of the information gathered through referring the application to the neighborhood and attempting to balance the concerns represented in the feedback received, and are the product of both suggestions from and conversation with the applicant. Thank you.
Director Seegers?
Yes. I don't believe the applicant's in favor of the hours. And I mean, particularly if you look at the music one, noon till 6 on Saturday or Sunday, that's indoor. You know, there's some real limitations around being able to actually provide a viable service and actually be able to expand the offerings they have to the community that the community's asking for. So, again, I wouldn't be in support of this, and again, I don't have a vote, but I'm bringing it up.
Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Other comments? Any questions from anybody? Director Hiltz, you had some suggestions?
Yes, I did. It was about, I have two, I guess they'll be separate motions, I suppose. Let me just find
No motions made yet. We're just dealing with the recommendations as they are on the paper right now, so they can be changed.
So I would be making a motion to amend one of the recommendations. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose it is technically. If I always look at it, if the resolution's on the table, then we amend the resolution. But if you want to amend the recommendation before it gets on the table, then it's just amending the paper. So if you want to suggest that how you'd like this rewritten, that would be fine.
Yes, that's how I'd like to proceed. Shall I go ahead?
We can make your suggestion. We can discuss it. Yeah.
Okay. It's to square kind of the language with respect to recommendation 2A. Performance data is also sometimes called monitoring data and effluent data, so there can be a little bit of confusion about what data we're going to be collecting. So I would be adding the words, it would be an and statement after performance data and effluent testing lab reports of the wastewater facility, just to put a little bit of clarity on that.
And effluent testing lab resorts.
And effluent testing lab reports.
Reports, okay. Yep.
Do we need to move on that one?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and the second one would be to add it would be a number 6, it would be and further that. Staff report back to the PCD committee regarding recommendations 2A by Q1 of 2020. That would be to add the level of transparency and to help to build the trust with the community, because there is a 1-year period of time. So it just adds a little bit of clarity, I think, to the neighborhood and to staff as to what they'll be doing.
Could you repeat that again then, please?
It would be number 6, and further that, staff report back to the PCD committee regarding recommendations 2A by Q1 2020.
Do you staff see any problem with that additional recommendation?
No, Chair Beamish.
Okay, or the change in that's proposed to recommendation number 2A?
No issues, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that being said, any other comments now? Director Pratt?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Being that these are additions to a recommendation that has already been put forward towards the applicant, I would ask that maybe the applicant be able to speak, or if we can ask a few questions, because the applicant has not yet appeared before this board.
Okay.
He has appeared before in delegations before the other board, or the previous board, yet I'd like to ask if he's interested or willing to address any of these questions that we may have.
Well, you're giving you a couple of great openings here. One is that open up the hours in terms of discussion, and the other one is just providing more information. So would somebody care to speak to it before we actually move the resolutions? Yeah. Please identify yourself.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Thank you, Director Pratt, for the chance to speak. In principle, I don't have a problem with those. Sorry? Yeah, I'm Brian Smith.
Thank you.
I wear the hat of the CEO, and I'm one of the co-owners of Persephone Brewing Company. In principle, I don't have a problem with either of those changes to the recommendations. To speak to the hours, it's true that in an ideal world, I would prefer to see the hours included in this resolution lined up with the existing regulatory hours. So either lined up directly and aligned with the liquor control hours or with the SCRD bylaws. I don't really think there's much to be gained by further inhibiting our hours as they've been described thus far, but we're willing to live with that and work within that if that's what the SCRD feels is important.
And I guess one sense that I would have with at this point in time changing the hours is, was there, if members of the public had read this report and chose to say, okay, I can live with that sort of thing, and then suddenly we're on to 4 a.m. in the morning every weekend, it could be a change that they might be surprised about. They might have been preferred to be here to register a comment, and that's the only concern I have relative to changing something like that at this point. But Director Siegert?
Thank you. What would the hours be? Do you have that information with you?
Shoot, I do in a text. I will say, if I'm to prioritize what's important in terms of our business viability, and frankly from a cultural and social perspective in our community, the music hours is the more inhibiting one than the length, the opening hours. The fact is, with our tasting room license endorsement that we currently have, we could be open much later than we already are. In fact, we've been operating for 5.5 years, closing no later than 9 o'clock on any night, when our tasting room hours allow us to go to 11 or later on some days. So the fact is, our business operation really isn't a pub. It's not a late night venue, and it never will be. But being able to have music outside of those particular hours, for example, if our musicians are coming from Vancouver and they miss a ferry, so to be able to push them a couple of hours here or there, those music hours lining up with the open hours might be a simple compromise. Notwithstanding, I take your point about neighbors not having yet, a chance to respond to a recommendation per se. If you would like the specific, sorry, bear with me one quick second here, the specific hours that are laid out in our liquor regulations for a lounge license are that a retail store may sell product between 9 a.m. and 11 p.m. daily. And that is one of our endorsements, is to be a retail store, so off sale, essentially people buying and taking away. And that lounges may operate between 9 a.m. and 4 a.m. Is the, or otherwise regulated by the branch. And I will say, with your recommendation and approval of this DVP, our next step is to take it to the Liquor Control and Cannabis Branch for their approval as well. So they may further sort of restrict hours. And then, as probably everybody's somewhat familiar with, the SCRD noise bylaw hours is that, there's no noise after 11 p.m. essentially is the one that's directly applicable here. So.
Thank you. Director Seegers?
I don't get to make a recommendation, so I think it's up to the rest of the board.
What does the board feel? Director Hills?
My sense is that this is a compromise. It's a win-win situation, I think, for the neighborhood, a chance to build some trust, which is the previous board had considerable concern about that, and I think the applicant is satisfied. I think it's kind of stays the course. I think we have agreement that this works at this point in time. And in the future, the applicant could come back. Is that true, to alter the hours? Is that in the future?
Yes. Presume that would be it. Yeah. Traditionally, it would be, yes. Or for a special event. There could be a special event hours be changed if requested. Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. There are special event provisions set by the Agricultural Land Commission in their regulations that do allow some changes to operation for those events. However, with the hours of operation set in a covenant on title, the process to amend those hours would be to amend that covenant. So effectively, no. Hours of operation could not be changed beyond those specified for a special event. Thank you.
Okay. Director McMahon?
Does that apply to hours for music? Can you put music on a covenant?
Mr. Hall?
As music hours are an operating parameter, they can be specified in a covenant. Yes.
would it be possible under the covenant to include an opportunity for the applicant to make application for special events from time to time? And in fact, I have seen approvals of a certain number of special events that could be requested in a calendar year. Would that be a... Mr. Hall?
Thank you for the moment to confer, Chair Beamish. Staff are just discussing the practicality of that. The purpose of the covenant is to set conditions that are more or less immovable, and so practically that approach of including some variability would seem to be a challenge. Thank you.
Okay. Director Seegers.
Thank you. As you know, we have Bricker's Cidery in Sechelt, and I know that when they are looking at doing a special event, they actually have to apply for a special event permit, totally separate from their operation, and are only allowed to do, 10 a year or something like that, under the guidelines?
Yeah, and to be more specific, not only do you have to apply for a special event, you have to de-license your existing license, then apply for a special event permit to get those sort of extra provisions. And it's true under the Agricultural Land Reserve. I believe it's 10 per year. That is the maximum that you can do.
Mm-hmm. So you can't do something. I mean, I ran into this through the election process. Right, I was looking at doing an event, and we were looking at having something set up outdoors, but because of the time frame and the length of time and the rigmarole basically to actually do it, we said, no, we're not going to use that facility. So it impacts both the users and the facility because of the processes that have to be put in place in order to be able to work around their operations that we limit.
Okay, is there a way out of this? Is there, Director McMahon?
While I appreciate the issues that Director Seegers raised, this has been quite the saga. And it's complex because of the overlapping jurisdictions involved, and I think that staff has come up with a workable solution that we can go forward with. So I'm kind of reluctant to monkey with this too much on the fly.
Okay. Yep. Director Hiltz?
I would agree with that statement as well, and I think it does go a long ways to mending the fences, as the term has been used in the past.
Yeah. All right. Director Pratt.
I would concur as well. I know this has been a long process, and with the amount of staff hours and dedication to the file, as well as the applicant's dedication to this file, it's to edit something on the fly, especially when registering the covenant on title, and I think this is something that we can if it gets it's obviously we're hearing some appetite to revisit after we've had some time with it to see, and I mean, I'd encourage the applicant to continue the conversations with staff. I would like to really see this move forward in the way, because I know how much time and effort and there's been a bit of a hamper on business, and I'm also wondering about the board's appetite for maybe moving this to the board agenda this afternoon, just so we can have a couple of weeks, because once we approve the recommendations, I don't see any further need to hold it up for a couple of weeks until the next board meeting.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And somebody like to move the recommendations as they have been added to? Director Hiltz?
Yes, I'll move the recommendation.
That's all 6 of them.
That's all 6 of them now, that 2 through 6. And second by Director McMahon. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Nobody? Oh.
I'd just like to make a recommendation that it does go to the board this afternoon, which would be
yes. Yep.
which would be now be number
Yep.
7.
So that's a further resolution?
That would be a last resolution. So.
Motion that this be moved to the agenda for the regular committee of the whole, this regular board meeting this afternoon, and moved by Director Pratt, seconded by Director Hiltz. All in favor? Approved. Thank you. Thank you. And the other item that we moved forward on the agenda is the item, I believe it was item 7. This is the frontage waiver for subdivision SD 00000 Radisson Electoral Area E. So that somebody who will make that report? Mr. Hill, introduce the report, or Mr. Allen? This is on the frontage.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. This is a subdivision within Elphinstone, and phase 1 of the 2-phase subdivision is nearing completion. And this particular report pertains to the frontage requirement of parcels. The Local Government Act stipulates that parcels must have or shall have 10% of their perimeter fronting onto a road. In this particular case, the parcels along the road, while close, do not meet the full 10%, and a waiver of this requirement is required in order to proceed. The subdivision has long since been reviewed by SCRD. There's been a preliminary layout approval issued by the Ministry of Transportation. The layout has been considered by all parties. In order to mitigate the fact that the parcels do not meet the full 10%, the layout here has provided for adjacent properties to share a driveway apron off of the road to essentially cut the driveways fronting onto the road in half. And this is a good value add part of the design to reduce the amount of separate driveways along this portion of the road. And in order to see this phase 1 move towards completion, staff do recommend that the board consider waiving the frontage requirement for this particular subdivision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Somebody move receipt of the report, please. Director McMahon, Director Ties, all in favor? And that's approved. And the recommendation, a requirement of 10% road frontage be waived. I have a question first. Okay, Director McMahon.
I just have a question about process here, because this went to the OCP 2 years ago, and the driveways have all been completed. So this seems to be coming in a strange order. Is there any explanation of how we come to be voting on this after the thing is completed?
Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Planning staff at SCRD review a subdivision and the subsequent layout. We refer it to the Advisory Planning Commission for comment. Our conditions related to respective bylaws and Advisory Planning Commission comments are forwarded to the Ministry of Transportation. The Ministry considers SCRD comments, their comments, comments from Vancouver Coastal Health, all other service providers, and issue the preliminary layout approval. Upon receipt of the preliminary layout approval, it's incumbent upon the applicant to work through those conditions.
Sorry, would you introduce yourself, please? And if you're going to speak to the microphone. Thank you.
Randy Verhulst. I'm the owner of Ranson Holdings and the property on Veterans Road. And so what Mr. Allen was referring to was the process of the applicant applying for the frontage waiver. And that's indeed the language in the documentation that I received. But there's many things that I've had to pay for, and a lot of paperwork back and forth. But I'm sure it's my fault, but I've never really understood clearly that I actually had to formally apply for the frontage waiver. So for future individuals like myself, it might be helpful if the instructions actually lay that out in the beginning, because apparently I could have done this a year ago and had this voted on before we actually installed the driveways, we had the SCRD install the water lines on the property, so it does seem a little bit backwards. And of course, when I heard that I had to apply for this and have a vote on it at this stage, I probably aged about 5 years. And so it just wasn't clear to me that that was the process. And, everything's been fantastic dealing with the SCRD staff to this point, but that was definitely a glitch that I would recommend be addressed a little bit differently in the future. So, but thank you for passing it.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Well, we haven't passed it yet. You haven't talked yourself out of it yet.
Okay.
Director Hills?
I'd like to ask the applicant, could you describe the glitch and where you think that process could be improved?
Well, there's many steps in the application, all of which, once I filled out the initial application approximately 2 years ago, there was Ministry of Transport paperwork as well. So there was a long application process that the SCRD helped me through, and there was fees to pay, and we had to apply for the water lines and all these different things. But I never came across anything that said, here's step 5, you have to apply for the frontage waiver. But like I said, the language did say apply for frontage waiver, but there was other things in there as well that I've never actively had to pursue. It just kind of came along with the process. So, perhaps if the language was more like saying that I have to, put in a separate application for this frontage waiver to be voted on by the board before it passes, you might want to do that at an early stage to make sure, because this sounds like a condition that is, the frontage is supposed to be 10%, ours is 8.4, so it's not that far off. But there might be a condition where it's more critical, and maybe there's reasons why it wouldn't pass. So I doubt that anybody would allow it to get this far in that situation. But, maybe there's a gray area. Maybe someone does a bunch of work on a property that they think they have approval for, and then suddenly they have to put the brakes on it and change everything at a late date, which could have been avoided by a clarification of this frontage waiver.
Okay, well, thank you. Let us proceed, and we'll see if we're going to approve it.
Okay.
So,
thank you very much.
Did we move a second the resolution? So it's on the table. All in favor? Opposed? Been passed. Thank you.
I just have one thing.
Director McMahon?
Do we communicate back with our APCs about, because they made the request that the driveways be shared because of the concern about the traffic on that road and the number of driveways in a short distance, issuing onto the road. Their recommendation was actually taken up, but nobody communicated back to them to say that this happened. So what's our process here when and this is getting on for some time ago, but the APC gets involved in these things, and do we keep them in the loop about developments?
Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Staff do communicate regularly with APCs, and some applications, as a process step, do come back for information. Sometimes results are shared back. It is an area that, on reflecting on the Director's question, staff will review to see if there are opportunities for improvement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if I can speak, having been an approving officer from the municipal side, very often because we are dealing with more than one jurisdiction here, particularly highways in this case, they actually will sign off the subdivision. They can't do that until this is done. So coordination with them as well as to saying, what else do we need to do. So but Mr. Hall, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
Thank you. My colleagues are just reminding me of an important process piece that I omitted in my answer. The minutes of other APCs and the minutes of this committee are also shared back to APCs. That's an important link back to communicate result and closure on files.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lee.
I just have kind of a question about the design of the driveways. Just out of curiosity, the driveway is shared. Does that mean it's twice as wide as a normal driveway?
I'm sorry, Mr. Lee. Your question was to staff or to me, through staff to me?
It's
through me to staff?
Yes,
okay.
please.
And can they respond? Are they able to respond?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. Ordinarily, the Ministry of Transportation requires a 6-meter wide asphalted driveway apron, and 6 meters is wide enough that it could accommodate a double width of a driveway. 6 meters, close to 20 feet, is significant for a rural area driveway apron, and will be sufficient. Thank you.
That answer your question, Director Lee? Maybe we could talk about it later. Thank you. Considering the time now, does any member of the board wish to take a 5-minute break before we proceed? Okay, could we adjourn for 5 minutes, please? Motion to adjourn. Director McMahon moved and Director Hill seconded. All in favor? On Spendthrift Properties, Electoral Area F. Planner?
Thank you, Chair Beamish. The SCRD received a provincial referral to comment on an application for a private residential group mortgage on the west side of Kitts Island. The group mortgage serves the 2 upland strata parcels, which can be accessed primarily by water. Land use planning on Kitts Island is under the jurisdiction of the Islands Trust. SCRD's interests on Kitts Island are limited to services that we provide, such as building inspection and parks. Staff have reviewed the referral from the perspective of those services, and we found that they are not affected. Therefore, staff recommend responding to the province with the option that SCRD has no objection to the project subject to conditions identified in this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seo. Somebody please move for receipt of the report. Director Hiltz, Director McMahon, all in favor of receipt? Discussion report. Is there any discussion at this time? Director Hiltz?
I'll just ask one question of staff. There was the phrase a typical timber frame float system. Is that like a the issue of the polystyrene in West Howe, in the Howe Sound area, is timber frame float system includes polystyrene?
Mr. Hall?
Thank you, Chair. That information is not that detail is not included in the referral package that was provided to staff.
Mr. Hiltz?
Is it typical for the regional district to add that as a recommendation to seek alternatives to polystyrene in floats? Is that something suitable?
Mr. Hill, yes.
Thank you, Chair. In answer to the Director's question, staff typically include conditions referencing the best management practices for moorage facilities for referrals that are within our planning areas. As this is within the jurisdiction of the Islands Trust, the review is constrained just to our service areas. Thank you.
A different lane, would we say? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hiltz, Director Hiltz, would you like to move the recommendations?
Yes, I would.
Okay, seconded by Director McMahon. And that's recommendations 2 and 3 as they appear before you. Okay, all in favor? Opposed? See none? Motion passes. Thank you. And then moving next on to Annex G, which is the development variant permit, DVP 00040 for electoral area A.